Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video in this series on how to install Drupal on a Debian-based server. As of this recording, the most recent version of Drupal is Drupal 9, which came out maybe a month ago, possibly two. I'll also be using a Debian 10 server. Many of the commands that I'll be running in this tutorial may not work on older versions of Debian. For instance, Debian 8 may not actually use the same commands that I'll be using in this Debian 10 environment. So if you have an older version of Debian, now might be the time to upgrade. I have videos which I'll provide links for in the description below on how to upgrade from Debian 8 to Debian 9 and Debian 9 to Debian 10. I'll also be demonstrating how to do this using a virtual machine. I use VirtualBox and I have installed my Debian 10 server on that. There are plenty of videos out there to show you how to do that. I also have one on my channel. It's a little older. I think it's still good, but I'll provide a link to that below so that if you need to set up an environment free to follow along with this, I would highly recommend VirtualBox and setting up a Debian 10 server on that. We'll be using the command line to do this installation. I won't be using any GUIs. I won't be using PHP MyAdmin. This is strictly command line based, and my intent behind that is to provide people who would like to learn how to use the command line some examples of how to do that. So you can also think of this as kind of a tutorial on how to use the command line. I won't assume that any viewer has a strong background in Linux, so I will try to narrate what I'm doing in a way that's understandable to beginners. And one more thing before we start, I'm going to be using a Linux-based terminal to access my server. You could use Putty, Putty. You can Google that. If you're on a Windows environment, the way I'm going about things, you will need to use Putty in order to follow along and get into your server. And of course, there are plenty of videos on YouTube that will show you how to set up Putty, how to access your server using Putty, so on and so forth. In this video, I just want to focus specifically on the commands you need to run in the terminal in order to set up Drupal. Okay, and with that, we'll jump right into the tutorial. First thing we'll do is look at the Drupal website. So the first thing we'll do is open up a browser, and we'll go to drupal.org. And from here, there's all sorts of information on this site, really good information. It gets pretty granular, it gets pretty complicated. We'll try to keep things simple in this tutorial. Normally I like to just go down a list of instructions when I do these sorts of things. And in this case, there's a couple of places where you can get instructions. I'm going to focus on the easier ones. They're kind of the quick and dirty ones, just because it would be a much longer video if we looked at the more in-depth resources. So what we're going to do is go to Resources and Documentation, and if we scroll down a little bit under this Community Guides heading, there's an Installing Drupal link. This is what we'll be using today in this tutorial, so I'm going to click on that. And I'll just give you a quick rundown of what I intend to do. So before this video is done, we'll take a look at this Drupal installation link. And then what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll get the code. We will not be doing step 2, the install dependencies with Composer. I've never used Composer. I don't have anything against it. I've never used it. So I'm not going to go that route. And I'll show you what we need to do if we're not going that route. We'll create the database. I don't think we need to worry about the configure your installation. I'm going to do the setting up of the web server actually here in the get the code tutorial. So that'll be in the next video. I'll show you how to do that. Then we'll run the installer. There's quite a bit of troubleshooting that tends to have to happen after that's run. So we'll go through that, and then we'll do the status check, and we'll show you how to resolve any issues that come up with the status check. So what we're going to do now is set up our server, and we'll do that in this before Drupal installation. And you can read through this. There's some interesting information here. But essentially what it's telling us is we need to configure our server and install the software and dependencies that Drupal requires in order for things to work. And this is very similar to any other kind of open source web application, WordPress, Omeka, anything else that I've put up on my YouTube channel. They're all pretty similar, and they all require this what they're calling an AMP stack. You'll also hear it referred to as a LAMP stack: Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. And so in this case, we already have Linux set up, and what we need to do is install Apache, MySQL, and the basic PHP extensions that Drupal requires. And there's not many of them. It's pretty universal that we would install things like PHP, MySQL, and the lib Apache 2 mod PHP and all that. So we'll show you how to do that, and that's what we'll do right now. So in my case, in order to get to my server, I like to use a terminal. If you're using Windows, you'll need to use PuTTY, as I mentioned before. And if you're a Mac user, it is Unix based, just like I'm running a Debian Linux distribution as my desktop here. So any Linux distribution, you should be able to just use the terminal, or if you're using a Mac, you can just use the terminal. So that's what I'm going to do. And in order to get to my server, I need the IP address. I'll pause the video and let me find that IP address. Actually, maybe I'll just show you quickly that I'm running VirtualBox. I have my Drupal tutorial running. This is the server I'm going to put everything on. And you can see I'm running my Debian desktop environment that I use for development, also in a virtual machine. So I have this running right now. I've opened it, and let's see, what I can do is, here's the terminal. If I run the IP address command, so if I do IP address, I can get the IP address for this, and it's right down here. I can't capture that with my cursor, but it is the 10, it's a few lines up from the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from the bottom. So 10.3.20.11 is the IP address for the server I want to get into. And the reason why I'm using a terminal and not using this here is because there's more functionality within the terminal, and this just gets frustrating. So I don't go directly into the VM to edit things. So I'm just going to minimize this, and what we'll do is sshjkellogg, so whatever your username is for that server, and then in my case I'm going to put in the IP address 10.3.20. I think it was 11. And so it's asking for that Drupal server's user's password, so I'm just going to put that in. And I am now in, and we can tell that because the host name is Drupal tutorial. And I'm just going to clear this before we get started. Okay, so now we can start running our commands, and there's a list of them that we'll need to go through. The very first thing that I like to do before setting this stuff up is to run the Sudo Apt update command. And put in my password. And so to install things, we're using a repository. In this case, it is the apt repository. If you're using a different Linux distribution, for instance, if you're using an Arch-based distribution, you're going to be using the Pacman repository. And if you're using a Red Hat-based Linux distribution, you'll likely be using the Yum repository. So in our case, we're just running with the apt repository. That is the repository default to Debian. Okay, so we've done our updates, and now we need to upgrade. So sudo apt upgrade, and this might take a while, so I will pause the video as it's upgrading. Okay, great. So that ran successfully. What I like to do next is run the sudo apt auto remove. You could also do auto purge. And what this will do is remove all sorts of files and directories that are no longer in use, that have been upgraded and can now be removed. They've been replaced. And so that has run successfully, and that just keeps disk space freed up on your system. It's not crucial, just good practice. Okay, so now we can start installing the software and dependencies we need for Drupal. And the first thing we need is a web server, so that's the A in the AMP stack. And we do that on a Debian system with sudo apt install. So we're telling the apt repository we want to install Apache 2. And that should go relatively quickly. It's usually a pretty quick install. And then next what we're going to do is install the database. And MariaDB tends to be the default with Debian-based distributions these days. You could also install MySQL, but we're going to do MariaDB. And to do that, we can run sudo apt install MariaDB/server. And that should give us everything we need for the database. Unable to locate. Oh, I have a typo in there. I got to spell it right. Server. And yes. On older distributions of Debian, I'm not sure if that is the same command. So again, I'm running Debian 10 right now. And if you're running into problems with this, it's pretty likely you're running a different version of Debian. Okay, so that was the basic install, and we can configure our database so that it is more secure, and I think that's a good idea. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can do it with a directive that comes with MariaDB, and that is sudo mysql underscore secure underscore installation. So sudo mysql underscore secure installation, and we'll hit enter on that. You'll also notice that we're using MySQL instead of MariaDB. MariaDB is a derivative of MySQL and is completely, pretty much completely compatible with it. So you'll see me using some MySQL commands here and there, and the reason is it's just that MariaDB is a derivative of MySQL. So that's why it works, and that's why I'm doing that. The important thing is when I installed the database, I installed sudo apt MariaDB server and not sudo apt install mysql-server. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and they're asking me to enter the current password. Now when we installed this, we were never asked to put in a root password, so what they're saying here is enter for none, and so I'm just going to press enter. And then set root password, yes. And so I'm just going to put in a password. And don't forget your password because you're going to need this later. Remove anonymous user. So they're explaining things here, and it's pretty straightforward. It's a good idea to remove these before we go into a test environment. So I'm going to hit yes. Disallow login, disallow root login remotely. Yes, we want to make sure people cannot remotely log in as root. Remove test database and access to it. Yes, this was just for installing purposes and testing out the installation, so it's safe to get rid of. And reload privilege tables now. So what we're going to do is just kind of flush all the privileges on the tables and let the new privileges take effect. So this is just a way of not having to restart MySQL. So essentially you just want to say yes to everything. And you'll see that even though I was using that MySQL directive, it's telling us thanks for using MariaDB. Okay, so we have the A and the M in our AMP stat. We have Apache, we have MariaDB or MySQL. And so now we just need the PHP installation and a couple of extensions for that. So first what we're going to do is install PHP, and this is a good example of where the command I'm using for Debian 10 is likely going to be different on Debian 8 or Debian 9. I think in Debian 8 and 9 you have to specifically tell apt what version of PHP you want. And I could be wrong on that, but if you run into problems after running this command that I'm about to show you, that is likely the reason. So we'll do sudo apt install php, and I'll pause this. Okay, so now we can see that we have PHP 7.3.19-1 installed. I don't know if Drupal requires us to have 7.3 and above or 7.1 or above, which is another reason why it's probably a good idea to be running a more modern version of Debian or a Debian-based system, because the older versions, if you sudo apt install PHP, you might get like 5.4 or something like that. So you don't want that. It's a real hassle to kind of upgrade. So it's a good idea just to do it now so that you don't have to face that headache in the future. And so the next thing we're going to do is add the PHP Mysql extension. So we do that with, sudo apt install php-mysql. And again, as a MySQL. As a derivative of MySQL, this will work with MariaDB as well. And yes, and so what this does is allows PHP and MariaDB to communicate with one another. We also want Apache 2 to be able to communicate with PHP, because PHP kind of runs as a go-between between your database and your web server. So we need PHP to be able to communicate with our Apache server, and we can do that with sudo apt install lib apache 2-mod-php. And at this point, we should have a web server up and running, and we can check on that by just going to the URL or the IP address. In my case, I'm going to have to use an IP address because I don't want to go through the hassle of configuring DNS tables. So what was it, 11, I think? Yeah. And so we get the default Apache page here, and that lets us know that we have successfully created our web server, and that pretty much completes this video. So hopefully everything is up and running for you as well. And then in the next video, we will go over the next step in the process, and that will be the get the code section of this web document. So hopefully I'll see you in the next video.